Right, James, welcome to Easy Conversations. Thank you for joining me today. And I really appreciate you coming on the show and wanting to have this conversation with me. And definitely something we haven't covered on the podcast, but it is an issue I see quite a bit. And then that can bring about a lot of fear and shame when it comes to our ability to speak and our speech. So I'm sure we'll dive into a lot of that. But before we get started, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself and who you are and what's brought you here today.
You hit the nail right on the head right off the get-go there, because stuttering isn't the barrier. It's the fear and shame. And once you release those, your voice becomes unstoppable.
Yeah.
But there is a little bit more too than just openly stuttering and thinking everything's going to be fine. Why don't I get into my story and you'll understand where that comes from. I started my journey into therapy for stuttering before I even finished grad school. I was doing my master's in speech therapy in 2008, and I went and I did a practicum at Columbia Speech and Language Services in Vancouver, and they had an intensive 10-day program for 10 adults who stutter, many of them quite intensely. Mm. And it's a 10-day program, and by the end of it, we went from intense stuttering to extremely fluent. But there's more to it, because fluency, like not stuttering, is only part of the equation when it comes to stuttering therapy.
Okay.
The other side of it is self-acceptance. I mean, this is how I learned about this the hard way. I'd been working after grad school. I started working with all sorts of different people who stutter because I had mentors in the field. I had Lisa Avery and Sandy Bohm and the head of Columbia Speech and Language Services, Wendy Duke. And these were all big names in Vancouver in the stuttering world. And I was lucky enough that they were sending me clients and mentoring me, and this was going really great. And I was doing the same thing as we did in the 10-day intensive. I was getting clients in, we were working on fluency, they were learning how to not stutter, they'd leave, and I was feeling pretty good at myself. I'm good at this, great. Yeah. And then later on in my life, I started to go through my own midlife crisis. I was a generalist SLP, and I was getting burned out and went through a divorce. I got a brain tumor that had to be operated on, and I just blew up everything, and I wanted to do something really meaningful. So I started Stuttering Blueprint, and I started it the way I'd always done it. I'm on a fluency, not stuttering approach. And I wanted to reach out to some of my old clients just to see how they are doing, and maybe see if they'd like to give me a testimonial or something. And what did I find? But my star client, the guy who was the best client I ever had, who did all his homework, who stuck to it, who was the most fluent, I talked to him, and it's now been 10 years, and the self-doubt crept back in, the avoidance behaviors crept back in. That's avoiding words and sounds, avoiding speaking situations. Those would all come back in for him, and he didn't have the self-confidence that he had when he left. And I kind of blew my mind. I was like, oh, I thought I was good at this, but apparently my therapy wasn't working long term. So I went and I spoke to Kim Block, which is another friend of mine, and she used to be the president of the BC Association of People Who Stuttered. And she started to tell me all about ableism. And then, so ableism is this concept that when someone speaks differently, or or say someone's in a wheelchair, that's somehow less good than being someone who can walk. Or someone who stutters has an inferior way of talking to someone who doesn't stutter. That's ableism, and it's rife within our society. And I was like, oh my gosh, I've been part of this problem. I've been promoting fluency as a better way of speaking. So this kind of hit me in the heart, because I care a lot about my clients, and this is not something I wanted to be a part of. So that sent me on a deep dive into the research again, not only ableism, but I came across a study, not so much a study, but a forum of some of the biggest names in speech therapy. Barry Guitar is one of the people who's been around the longest. He actually wrote the textbook I learned from in grad school. And he and a bunch of other leading experts have now acknowledged stuttering as a neurodiversity. So, in the same category as, although very different from, autism, ADHD, being left handed. So, from there, I realized something had to change in my approach. So, I went on to do a lot more work, take more courses, learn more. I started to learn about acceptance commitment therapy. I started to learn about avoidance reduction therapy, covert stuttering to overt. So covert stuttering is the hiding of the stutter. And most people who stutter out there, you wouldn't even know because they're using avoidance techniques to hide the stutter, which may work to make them seem fluent, but it causes all kinds of psychological problems when you're living in hiding, essentially. So that is where I went from having a one-sided approach to a holistic approach. And that's what's making a real difference now.
Okay, I appreciate all of that. Thank you, James, for building on how you've been able to navigate all of this. But I am curious to understand on the personal level, because you did share your own adversity, right? Whether it was divorce and the brain tumor, how were you able to navigate that and still have this motivation and passion for going into this speech therapy world and doing more in this field where you felt that perhaps there was something lacking? What allowed you to navigate all of your own adversity and then wanting to help other people who perhaps are dealing with adversity in a different sense?
I was very fortunate in that I met a friend, my friend Matt Cohn, and he started to talk to me about meditation. I had a small meditation practice beforehand, but this really accentuated it. And I was doing half an hour a day, it was building. And he talked me into going to Nepal and India to do some volunteer work, karma yoga, you could call it, and do this course called Vipassana, which is a 10-day silent meditation retreat. And I was still building the business while I was doing this. So I was very busy, not during Vipassana. That is very much a focused thing. But in Vipassana, I came to very many realizations. I had to let go of the shame that I felt about being a bad therapist, feeling like I had let my clients down by only giving them part of the therapy that they needed. And the letting go of that shame and the letting go of many other things that were due to in the divorce, things that probably may have contributed to my brain tumor. That's not a medical opinion, just a thought in my head. Letting go of those things, doing some work that was not about me at all. And working for Karma Flights in Nepal, we went and we distributed winter coats to 1,743 children in the Rakhum region of Nepal. And it took me out of myself. And then when I came back from that, I felt healed. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone who stutters needs to go through this like hero's journey situation, but maybe on a smaller level without having to leave the country, that is possible.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate that. And you touched on one of the, if we were to call modalities when it comes to speech therapies around self-acceptance. And what I'm hearing from your story is that self-acceptance needed to start with you, right? So for you to be able to have that level of acceptance that you're doing the best you can, you've gone through this whole journey of divorce and there's shame around that, but how can you have acceptance? Do you feel like going through that process also allowed you to become better at the work you were doing? Did it allow you to have a better understanding for your clients as well?
I think it was absolutely key. The early part of my life was I had a very easy, happy upbringing and things worked out. Everything seemed to be on a linear upward
Yeah.
path, getting better and better. And it wasn't until the rug got pulled out from under me. And in that process, it wasn't just the divorce and the brain tumor. There was also the financial crisis in there. I couldn't work for a while because of the brain tumor.
Yeah.
And that all ended up working out in the long run. But there was almost my entire life seemed to drop out from under me.
Yeah.
And if I hadn't been through that, I don't feel like I would have been the type of person that could deliver this
Mm.
properly. You almost have to go through the crucible yourself
Yes.
to help other people through it.
Yeah, absolutely agree, because it not only allows you to build that resilience, you can actually speak from a place of understanding. And majority of the times, what I've learned in therapy is it's that ability to share that space and empathy and compassion for your clients. And if it's something you haven't experienced yourself, and it doesn't always have to be the same, but when you have that level of understanding, the therapeutic process can be that much more powerful. And that's what I'm hearing from you. Now, to expand the whole notion of self acceptance, how does that help in the stuttering space? So if I'm someone who struggles, maybe I get nervous in larger crowds or when I'm speaking in front of people and I tend to stutter, how does self acceptance come into play and how does that help me in that process?
It helps in two different ways. One way is that it can actually reduce stuttering itself.
Mm.
When we accept that we might stutter, we're not holding on so tightly. We're not going for this sort of white knuckle fluency, which is what I talk about when we're avoiding and just trying anything to be fluent and just hoping that we're not, and we're just holding on like this. That bodily tightness can result in more stuttering. But what's even more important is that when we think about stuttering as part of the normal continuum, everybody stutters to a certain extent, and people who stutter more. It's almost like the term should be people who stutter more than average rather than people who stutter versus people who don't. So if you're a person who stutters more than average and you're afraid to stutter, you're going to get tight and stutter more. The other great thing is if you're accepting of yourself as a person who stutters, then if you do stutter, and you will sooner or later, because we all do, it's not going to throw you off. And what I hear from my clients is if they are in the flow and they're doing well, and then suddenly they stutter, it throws them for a loop. And then suddenly they're stuttering more and they're getting flustered. And if we can interrupt that, then the stuttering itself no longer matters. It's more about moving through it.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the ways I can relate to that is I've often heard in sports, and I mean, we're both in Canada, so we can talk about hockey, but some of the good
Yeah.
goalies I've heard about is, when you ask them, okay, you let in that soft goal, what's your mindset? And some of the good ones say, I'm just thinking about the next save. That goal is gone, right? And I think if I were to draw any parallel, that's what I'm hearing. I've just stuttered on this word. Now it's time to move on rather than keep ruminating on this mistake I made, because that's going to continue to come up and throw me off. Do you see some similarities there? Is that kind of the idea that you're talking about?
100%. It actually reminds me of a YouTube I saw with Roger Federer, just to bring like now tennis into it.
Yeah.
And he talked about winning 51 or something like that, 51, 52% of his points, which means that 49 or 48% of the time he was losing
Yeah.
a point. And this is one of the best tennis players in the world. So if he let that get in his head, he would just crash and burn. But he didn't. It was more about, okay, what's the next point? What's the next point? So when it comes to stuttering, it's what's the next word? What's the next sentence? I didn't get thrown off by the stutter that I just had. Also, we need to normalize it. I'll stutter on purpose just
Mm.
to let people know that this is a normal way to function. It's a valid way to communicate.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate that. And one of the things you had shared with me was when it comes to this stuttering piece, 80%, it's the 80-20 rule, but 80% of it is mindset rather than speech. So the remaining is speech. Are you able to elaborate on the mindset piece? Because we've touched on it in different ways, but how does that factor in to the whole notion of speech and when someone is trying to talk?
There was a, this is quite an old theory by Joseph Sheehan, and he talked about the stuttering iceberg. And so on top of the iceberg, the part you can see is the stuttering and the avoidance behavior. Underneath the iceberg is the mindset, just like what you were talking about, the thoughts about stuttering, your feelings about stuttering, your experiences, and the kinds of myths that we believe about stuttering, even though that they're false. So these kinds of myths can include like stuttering is, it's a problem or it's a disorder, which we now know it's not.
Yeah.
Or people who stutter can't be successful, but we've got the Americans have a now ex-president who stuttered. That's the most powerful man in the world.
Yeah.
So that's clearly a myth. We've got many famous people at the last Super Bowl. I mean, Kendrick Lamar and Samuel L. Jackson are both in the Super Bowl show, and they both are people who stutter. So these people are out there. So those kinds of myths, we need to debunk the myths. And then it's really, but beyond that, it's a personal journey and it's a sensation as well. Underneath the thought, stuttering isn't good enough, or I'm not good enough for it because I stutter, is an emotion.
Yes.
Fear, shame. And underneath that is a sensation. And sometimes it's that sensation, that, oh no, I'm going to stutter sensation, to put a word on it, that triggers the stutter. So if we can learn to tolerate that sensation, then we can learn to move through stutters or not stutter in those moments. Maybe they don't even happen because we're learning how to tolerate that sensation. Did that answer the question?
Yes, absolutely. And what I'm hearing, again, to expand on that fear and anxiety, and we've touched on it already, that often because of that fear and anxiety, we will avoid these situations. And it typically doesn't always have to be around stuttering, but in general, that with a lot of people, when they experience some sort of anxiety around a specific situation, avoidance is one way of coping with it. But in order to expose ourselves slowly, not all at once, we're able to navigate those situations. That's where exposure therapy is so important, which is a form of CBT. But another form of therapy you touched on was acceptance and commitment therapy. How does that factor in the work you're doing and help people from that avoidance standpoint?
I'm going to use the analogy that's very common from ACT. Some of your listeners may have heard it before. It's called the demons on a boat analogy. So the way that works is, imagine that you are on a boat, sailboat in the middle of the ocean. And underneath the deck, there are a whole bunch of demons. And they are whispering or yelling, depending on the situation, all of this negative self-doubt. You can't talk. Don't even try. If you try, you're going to fail and embarrass yourself. That's the kind of things they're saying to people who stutter. But this could work for anybody with any kind of self-doubt. So those demons have a deal with you. And when you are on the boat, if you agree not to touch the tiller, not to even try and steer, they'll stay quiet. They won't bug you. But if you dare to touch that tiller and try to aim the boat in a direction, they're going to come up from below and they're going to scream in your ear and they're going to tell you all sorts of terrible things about yourself. And so you're fine. You're like, one day you're thinking, I'm going to try touching that tiller. So up they come and you're like, oh my God, no, I don't want to hear this. Stop touching the tiller. I'm going to float aimlessly in my ocean. And they all go to back down. I feel better.
Yeah.
But then you start to see other boats. And they're going to this island, that cool island, this place that you want to visit. And you're like, I want to go there too. So you try and touch the tiller again, and the same thing happens. Mm-hmm. So what ACT is about, just like we're learning to tolerate that sensation, we're learning to tolerate rather than change, which is like CBT. We're learning to tolerate thoughts. realizing that they just are thoughts and that they just come and go like clouds in the sky. They can be really nasty thoughts like a big storm, but they can't affect the sky. So we're letting those clouds go. We're letting those demons rant and rave and do what they want. And we're holding onto that tiller and we're going where we're going.
Yeah.
So in that way, we learn to overcome stuttering or any kind of self-doubt.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that whole cloud analogy is something I share with clients as well when I'm talking about meditation with them, right? Because it's easy to beat ourselves up when it comes to meditation. And then there's this misconception that, oh, I should be free of thoughts and my mind should be clear when I'm meditating. But the thoughts will come and go. And the more we meditate, we're able to just observe them. And like you said, observe them as clouds that are passing through. We don't necessarily need to run with those thoughts. We don't need to internalize them. We can just see them for what they are and just let them pass. So I find that quite meditative as well when you're just observing those thoughts. Now, one of the things you touched on was there's been a shift in focus around stuttering with, especially in the last few years. You said it's no longer looked upon as a disorder. It's being looked at something that's neurodiverse. Are you able to expand on that? Is there anything else that's shifted in recent years that's helping people look at this now differently?
I think what's really helping people is you're starting to hear some very strong voices in the stuttering community that are very much for open stuttering. And I want to speak to those people because I have great respect for that. We need those voices. And we need to start normalizing stuttering. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of people, in fact, I would say the majority of people who stutter aren't there yet. And I do not think that it is wrong to pursue fluency as long as we're not teaching it in a way that says that fluency itself is better than, in an ableist kind of a way, than better than not speaking, better than stuttering in some way. So we can both pursue fluency and accept ourselves as people who stutter at the same time. It gets a little bit more complicated when we're working with children, which is not what I'm doing right now, but I have done in the past, because I'm not always sure that a child can hold those two things simultaneously. It would depend on the child. So things differ in the way we approach it with different ages. There is some back and forth about the Lidcombe program that was used for many years and still is used with young children. And I would say that the voices of people who stutter, who are more strongly in favor of open stuttering, would consider Lidcombe almost a form of abuse, because we're like trying to get these young children to stop stuttering. And I see their point 100%. I tried using Lidcombe a little in my early career. It didn't feel right to me. So I stopped and I moved to the Palin parent-child interaction for children, which I thought was much more about changing the environment to make speaking easier, as opposed to what Lidcombe does, which is it rewards fluent speech with praise. And it doesn't like punish disfluent speech, but it's trying to correct it. So it's definitely not something I would feel comfortable practicing now, but other therapists are doing it. And I'm going to leave that debate open to more than just me and you talking, I'd say.
Yeah. Okay. And I am wanting to understand this a little bit further, like the ableist view that you've touched on a couple of times. Is that the idea there? You're basically pushing for perfection rather than progress. Is that kind of the idea there? And that's where it can be often a challenge for people?
I think it's more this idea that one way of being is better than another.
Mm,
So let's take a different concept for a second.
sure.
I think that people are starting to understand that autism is not a flaw.
Hmm.
Autism is a different way of being. And
Yes.
there's a very strong autism movement that's made big progress in that direction. So I think for the most part, people are starting to realize that having autism or being autistic is not better or worse than being neurotypical. We don't have as strong a voice in stuttering yet.
Mm,
There's certainly the voices are powerful, but the number of people is small, the lobby is small. So ableism is more about realizing, or anti-ableism is more about realizing that stuttering is not worse than not stuttering, and having autism or being autistic is not worse than being neurotypical. That's where ableism comes in. Does that
yes.
answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. No, I appreciate that. And you've touched on this again, this movement. And when you and I had chatted previously, you've talked about this political movement around stuttering. Are you able to expand on that as well? Like, where are you seeing that movement on top of some of the things you've already shared with some powerful voices speaking up around it, stuttering being looked upon now as being not neurodiverse, and even what you just explained around one way of being is not better than the other? What are some of the other things that are happening in this movement that are making it easier for people to accept?
Wish it was louder. I think, I mean, it's loud, but I don't think it's a huge movement yet.
Yeah.
They're doing great work. I just don't think it's caught the attention of the public as much as other things. That there's a lot going on right now, right? There's so much happening that this movement isn't getting the attention that maybe it should. It definitely should. And that's what coming on your show is about. I get to advocate as well as just talk about my story
Yep.
and stuttering therapy and do those kinds of things. And I want to acknowledge the great work that they're doing, but also add my voice to it
Mhm.
because there's not as, it's not gaining as much traction as I would like it to. And if I could be the change I want to see in the world, which I try to bring, well, I know I bring to my therapy sessions, is I hold the space that stuttering is okay
Mhm.
relentlessly in my sessions. And that is what I would like to see. I would like to see people look at stuttering the way we look at left-handedness now.
Mhm.
Now, it wasn't that long ago that left-handedness was punished. People had their left hand tied down and they had to write with their right hand. And they were punished for using their left hand. And that was considered normal. And it was sinister. That means left in Latin, I think. Maybe
Yeah.
it's Greek. I don't know. But the way we treated left-handed people, and now if you did that now, you'd be looked at like you're crazy. And that's what I want to see for stuttering. I want to see it be no more of a big deal than being left-handed.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I could appreciate that. And do you feel like it is happening? It may just take time, like any movement. Often people start speaking up about it, but then over time it gets more recognized and gets more awareness. Or do you feel like it's been a bit stagnant and it's not moving as fast as as it should?
Well, over my lifetime as a therapist, I saw it back off for a while, at least in Vancouver. Like the BC Association of People Who Stutter basically lost momentum and stopped existing. So we saw a regression,
Mhm.
but now it's coming back the other way. And the time is right. Although we're seeing regression in many areas politically right now, we're also on a general upward trend towards acceptance
Mm.
of many different diversities. So now is the time to keep advocating, to keep stuttering as part of those conversations. I think we are definitely moving in the right direction and people are doing great work out there. I want to add my voice to it and just keep building that momentum. And I do think we will see the change that all of these people are working towards come to fruition within my lifetime.
Yeah, no, agreed. That's great. Now, one of the things you shared with me was there is an exercise that people can do that can help. Are you able to shed some light on that or expand on what this exercise is? And
Yeah, I can run you guys through the exercise right now if you like.
yeah, that would be great.
Okay, let me speak directly to anyone who's listening who stutters right now, because this is mainly for you, but anyone can do it because it is about understanding stuttering. So this is an exercise I developed with my own speech coach, Alyssa DeCaro, and she's using elements of her ground core presence technique. So if you're not driving or operating heavy machinery, I invite you to close your eyes and hold out your hands in front of you like this. You've got two open hands. Imagine in one hand a time in your life where you were so focused or so determined or just so present that you were getting your message across. You were talking to someone, you were expressing yourself, and you didn't care that stuttering was happening. Maybe you were angry or you were emotional or something was happening where you were just so determined to get your message across to this person that stuttering was happening and you didn't even care. So remember that. Hold that in one hand. Now, on the other hand, imagine another time in your life where you were also present or determined or focused or motivated, and you were getting your message across. You were expressing yourself with total fluency. You either didn't stutter at all or you stuttered way less than usual. And it just felt so powerful that you were so available to just speak more fluently. And hold that in this second hand. Now, feeling both hands, and imagine just for a moment, just for an experiment, a thought experiment, imagine for a moment that you do not value one hand over the other, one experience over the other, that they're both equal and valid experiences, both equal and valid methods of communication. As you consider holding these both as equal, notice how you feel. Notice any resistance that might come up. Maybe it's a sense of huge liberation. Maybe it's a sense of possibility, like you've never imagined what it would be like to not judge one as better than the other. So take a moment to feel both of them and imagine that they were each a valid way of being in the world. And now put your hands together and connect to your own body. Feel your hands touching each other. Feel them learning from each other. Feel them informing each other, these two possibilities. And then imagine that on the inside of you, it doesn't matter which way you express yourself. What matters more is the way you feel about the expression, the way you feel about how you're showing up in the world, and that you actually can have more choice over how you feel about the way you communicate. And maybe you're going to keep training and you're going to focus your energy like a martial artist or a performing artist to train and to get better and master this skill of fluency. And if that makes you feel good, and if that's meaningful to you, then you can keep getting better at fluency. Maybe it feels more important to you to master the acceptance of just free-flowing stuttering, and that feels really important. But what's most important is that you find what is comfortable for you and that you're not relying on one of these two outwards expressions to validate how you feel about yourself as a person.
Good relief.
How did that feel for you?
Yeah, I felt that as I was following along, like I said, it felt relieving to let that go, let go of that pressure.
Because for me, I don't want to claim that I have the lived experience of a person who stutters, but I have definitely experienced stuttering.
Mhm.
And the time that I've experienced it in grade 7, when I was asking a girl out for the first time, she said no. And then when I'm recording videos, oh my gosh, I stutter so much. So
Yeah.
again, I don't have the lived experience of worrying about my speech all the time, but I have had those experiences, and that sense of shame or embarrassment, those kinds of things. And to be able to let those go is very powerful. And these kinds of exercises help with that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think we touched on a lot of that. Again, the shame piece and feeling like a failure. And a lot of it is just through practice. And I think we touched on the exposure side of it and managing the avoidance. But is there anything else you feel like is helpful when people are navigating the space? And I think that exercise is definitely something people can use. But outside of everything we've talked about, is there anything else people should be able to work through when it comes to this?
If you need something in the moment, and I would suggest that there are no invalid ways of managing your stutter. Even word avoidance has its place. What I would say about word avoidance, though, is that if you're going off on a massive detour to avoid a certain word, coming up with an entire paragraph of conversation just to avoid a word that you stutter on, maybe that's not so handy. But if you can switch one word out, then why not?
Mhm.
But the if you want something, so I don't want to go too deep into fluency techniques in this environment, because it just becomes a fluency trick and it won't work for very long. Like it'll work for a little while, then it'll stop.
Yeah.
So rather than do that, why don't I go through another exercise I worked out with Alyssa? And this is one that I used even before I came on here. And again, I don't stutter. So this is a confidence technique as opposed to a fluency trick. And again, it's from her ground core presence approach. So if you're about to go into a speaking situation, I'm going to do this slow, but it can be done very quickly. You're about to go into a speaking situation, sit on your seat or you're standing, and you feel, if you're sitting, you feel your sits bones, those two bones in your hips that you're sitting on, and you feel like they're plugging into the earth. You can like rock back and forth on them just to feel, but you feel them very grounded and into the earth. And then you raise your body up like you're being held up. So you're light, but you're grounded. And then imagine the version of you that just doesn't care about being judged. You're in your power. You're strong. You have a message. And imagine that version and speak from there. Now, that's the fast version. It's better if we had more time. I'd take you through the slower version. You really get into that meditation, and then you practice it faster and faster. And then what I do is I've got this little hand motion, and my personal speaking avatar is when I was working as a speech therapist in a private school for many years. I was the one speech therapist. Everyone called me Mr. B. And I was well respected and, dare I say, loved in that environment. I always felt very strong, and like I was the speech therapist. I knew what I was talking about, and I was strong. So I imagine him, and he's like floating above this hole in the ground, and under the hole is like a big cenote, like a big, huge cave with the deep water that's very still underneath. And he's connected down into this deep water. And that water represents like the greater consciousness, or like the earth and the collective consciousness, the Atman, the soul of the universe. And I feel like I've got this person, this avatar that is the outward person, and then it's connected down deep to this source, the source of everything. And when I speak, it's coming through that. And I have this little hand motion that I start like this, and I bring it down, pull it all the way down with that deep sense. So that's my personal
Yeah.
one. I use these techniques myself.
Mm.
And if you start to develop these personal ways of doing things, then you very quickly ground to your core, speak your truth from the heart. And then whether that avatar up there is stuttering or speaking fluently doesn't matter so much as what's coming from that deep pool.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I think that's really helpful. James, thank you so much for sharing all of that and those couple of exercises. I'm sure people can really benefit from, including your own journey and all the work you're doing and some of the shifts we're seeing in perspective around stuttering. And to your point, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but I appreciate everything that you've been able to share today and some of the wisdom you've been able to impart on us. But for listeners that want to learn more about your work or find you online, what are some ways they can do that?
I've got a masterclass that goes into more detail about my program. And currently it's aimed at professionals and entrepreneurs. Should I read out the title for you?
Sure.
So it's the 3-step system that helps professionals and entrepreneurs who stutter to speak with conviction so they can confidently stand out in meetings, impress clients, and go after their goals without constantly worrying about their speech.
Mm.
And so if that resonates with you, I invite you to watch the masterclass, and then you can book a call with me and we just have a chat. It's definitely a no pressure situation. People have to be ready
Mhm.
for any kind of coaching or stuttering therapy. Any kind of coercion or pressure from anyone is just going to backfire.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Thank you again, James. I really enjoyed our conversation and I definitely took a lot back. So thanks for coming on here and sharing your story.
Thank you so much for having me, Furkhan.